When you're poor, it can be hard to go grab a cheeseburger or buy the newest video game, but that's not the worst part about it.
Number 25. At least 80% of humanity lives on less than $10 per day. Number 24. To put things into perspective, the top 20% of the world's population accounts for 3/4 of the world's income. Number 23. Half of the world's population accounts for only 5% of the world's income. Number 22. According to UNICEF, 22,000 children die every day due to poverty. Number 21. Nearly 1/3 of children in developing countries are estimated to be underweight or stunted. Number 20. Last year, about 70 million children of primary school age were not in school. Number 19. Nearly 1 billion people celebrated the coming of the 21st century without being able to read a book or sign their name. Number 18. Preventable diseases like malaria afflict nearly 500 million people every year. Number 17. Africa alone accounts for roughly 1 million deaths due to malaria annually. Most of them are children. Number 16. Speaking of children, there are 2.2 billion children in the world. Number 15. Half of them live in extreme poverty. Number 14. Over 1 billion people have inadequate access to water and 2.6 billion lack basic sanitation. Many times this means there's no separation of drinking water and toilet water. Number 13. That's why 1.8 million children die every year of diarrhea. Number 12. Approximately half of the world's population now lives in cities, and about 1/3 of those in the cities live in slum conditions. Number 11. In fact, slum growth is outpacing urban growth by a frighteningly large margin. Number 10. 1/4 of humanity lives without electricity. Number 9. The 7 richest people in the world make more than the poorest 41 countries combined. That's roughly 567 million people. Number 8. 0.14% of the world's population owns over 80% of the world's private financial wealth. The vast majority of that wealth has managed to avoid all income and estate taxes, either by the countries where it's been invested or where it comes from. Number 7. For every $1 in aid that a developing country receives, over $25 is spent on debt repayment. Number 6. The poorer the country, the more likely it is that the debt repayments are being extracted directly from the people who neither contracted the loans nor received any money. Number 5. In 1998, $8 billion was spent on cosmetics in the United States. $11 billion was spent on ice cream in the European Union. $17 billion was spent on pet food in Europe and the US. $100 billion was spent on alcohol in Europe. $400 billion was spent on narcotics globally, and $780 billion was spent on militaries around the world. Number 4. In the same year, $6 billion was spent on achieving basic education for all, $9 billion was spent on basic water and sanitation, and $13 billion was spent on basic health and nutrition for all. Number 3. If you're reading this list, then you are in the top 30% of the world's population when it comes to poverty and wealth. Number 2. With new technologies, we now grow enough food to feed 10 billion people, or 1.5 times the world's population. The problem is that most of the world can't afford to buy that food. And number 1. If the world spent less than 1% of what it spends on weapons, all the previously mentioned issues would be fixed.
To be honest, by personality, I'm just not much of a crier. But I think in my career that's been a good thing. I'm a civil rights lawyer, and I've seen some horrible things in the world. I began my career working police abuse cases in the United States, and then in 1994, I was sent to Rwanda to be the director of the UN's genocide investigation. It turns out that tears aren't just much help when you're trying to investigate a genocide. The things I had to see and feel and touch were pretty unspeakable. What I can tell you is this, that the Rwandan genocide was one of the world's greatest failures of simple compassion. That word compassion actually comes from two Latin words, cum passio, which simply mean to suffer with. And the things that I saw and experienced in Rwanda as I got up close to human suffering, it did, in moments, move me to tears. But I just wish that I and the rest of the world had been moved earlier. And not just to tears, but to actually stop the genocide. Now, by contrast, I've also been involved with one of the world's greatest successes of compassion. And that's the fight against global poverty. It's a cause that probably has involved all of us here. I don't know if your first introduction might have been choruses of We Are the World, or maybe the picture of a sponsored child on your refrigerator door, or maybe the birthday you donated for fresh water. I don't really remember what my first introduction to poverty was, but I do remember the most jarring. It was when I met Venus. She's a mom from Zambia. She's got 3 kids and she's a widow. When I met her, she had walked about 12 miles in the only garment she owned to come to the capital city and to share her story. And she sat down with me for hours and just ushered me in to the world of poverty. She described what it was like when the coals on the cooking fire finally just went completely cold, when that last drop of cooking oil finally ran out, when the last of the food, despite her best efforts, ran out. She had to watch her youngest son, Peter, suffer from malnutrition as his legs just slowly bowed into uselessness, as his eyes grew cloudy and dim, and then as Peter finally grew cold. For over 50 years, stories like this have been moving us to compassion. We whose kids have plenty to eat. And we're moved not only to care about global poverty, but to actually try to do our part to stop the suffering. Now, there's plenty of room for critique that we haven't done enough, and what it is that we've done hasn't been effective enough. But the truth is this: the fight against global poverty is probably the broadest, longest-running manifestation of the human phenomenon of compassion in the history of our species. And so I'd like to share a pretty shattering insight that might forever change the way you think about that struggle. But first, let me begin with what you probably already know. 35 years ago, when I would have been graduating from high school, they told us that 40,000 kids every day died because of poverty. That number today is now down to 17,000. Way too many, of course, but it does mean that every year there's 8 million kids who don't have to die from poverty. Moreover, the number of people in our world who are living in extreme poverty, which is defined as living off about $1.25 a day, that has fallen from 50% to only 15%. This is massive progress, and this exceeds everybody's expectations about what is possible. And I think you and I think honestly that we can feel proud and encouraged to see the way that compassion actually has the power to succeed in stopping the suffering of millions. But here's the part that you might not hear very much about. If you move that poverty mark just up to $2 a day, it turns out that virtually the same 2 billion people who were stuck in that harsh poverty when I was in high school are still stuck there 35 years later. So why? Why are so many billions still stuck in such harsh poverty?